Beautiful, hot last day of summer. Let's begin with some introductions. My name is Kathy Lazarus, and I'm with the League of Women Voters, and I've been representing them on the coalition for the last couple of years. We'll start over here, please.
I'm Whitney Devine. I'm with Los Altos Community Investments.
Victoria Brown with Los Altos Community Investments.
I'm Amy Franz-Black.
Jean Mardeau, mayor for another 3 months.
I'm Edie Egan, and I live in downtown Los Altos, and I'm on First Friday.
Great.
Laura Bays.
Jane Berlin, City Council.
And Nadine Andrew, candidate for City Council.
Start in the back there, Norma.
Norma Schroeder, resident.
I'm Joe Iyer. I'm with the Los Altos Community Foundation.
Kim Cranston with the Los Altos Community Coalition.
Scott Hunter with Los Altos Village Association.
Tamara Fagan, National Junior Basketball Board. I'm Marlene Iwamoto, Community Library.
Bob Simon, our next Library Committee.
Gary Anderson, interested resident.
Tricia Jordan, resident.
Hi, I'm Vicki Reeder with the Los Altos Women's Caucus and the Los Altos Stage Company.
David Rock, Los Altos Hills Little League is part of the coalition and also coach here.
Gloria Geller, community volunteer.
I'm Kim Hassan, Los Altos resident.
Great, thanks for coming. And back there, just walking through the door, we're wrapping intros.
Oh, hi.
Nancy.
Oh, sorry, Nancy Vermont. Hi,
Okay.
everybody.
All right, well, at least we all...
If I may interrupt, I don't know exactly when the questions are scheduled, but if your question is really important and you'd like to be recorded, saying it clearly in your own voice, please ask for the reason for this.
Okay. I think we're good to go. Thank you, thank you. So this morning we're going to talk about one of those hot topics in town, which is Measure C. To give us sort of an analysis of what the measure includes, we've invited Gary Hedden, who among his many activities in the community is also a longtime board member of the Los Altos Mountain View Area League of Women Voters. So in the interest of time, is that a sufficient, or should I go Greentown and Environmental Commission and it would take half of the meeting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gary, and then after Gary does his presentation, we should have ample opportunity for questions and discussion among the group. So Gary, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Kathy, and welcome everyone. Show of hands, who knows about the 19th Amendment? Maybe, yeah. It was the amendment to the Constitution that gave women the right to vote. Okay, that happened in 1920. And it was that same year that the League of Women Voters was formed. And I'm a board member, as Kathy said. Why was the League formed? Well, women finally had the right to vote after almost 60 years of struggle. But now they needed to be registered. The barriers to registration and voting needed to be eliminated. And we had to start the process of education and informing. And that's what the League has been doing for almost 100 years. I want to tell you a little bit about what our local league does, and then I'll get into our analysis on Measure C. I'll get there eventually, bear with me. We do things, for example, recently there was a discussion on dark money. Dark money is actually the lifeblood of both major political parties, and it's very important and somewhat disturbing. We register voters at the farmers market yesterday. We had one of our members there registering voters. Next week is National Voter Registration Week. We will be at the library right here on Tuesday registering voters. We also have forums. We do the candidate forums. Last Monday was the candidate. That wasn't our mission, but we were there. It was, but we do have on the city council candidate, we do have our own candidates forum for Los Altos City Council That's coming up October 2nd. 2nd? Yes, and that's a Monday. And then there's the one next week for the Mountain View City Council candidates, and that's on the 26th, which is a Wednesday. So these are the things that the league does that are so important, still important. On the state level, and I think you might be interested, you know that there are a lot of ballot measures that pop up every election cycle. There's a dozen this time. The state analyzes and takes positions where it fits their principles. They don't analyze and evaluate every measure, but for example, we're yes on 1, affordable housing bond. We're yes on 2, the homeless housing bond. We're no on 3, the water bond. We're no on 4, the children's hospital bond. We're no on 5, the property tax measure. We're no on 6, the gas tax repeal. And we're yes on rejecting Costa-Hawkins. So now, if you want some information, and it's only a short paragraph that tells you why we take these positions, go to our website, go to the Voter's Edge, League of Women Voters, Los Altos Mountain View. It's a very handy way to get some information. So the point is we do take positions on measures. We do not endorse candidates. And we're not taking a position on the daylight savings time, by the way. We leave that one to you. So in terms of thinking about Measure C, the local measure, we looked at it from 3 principles that we think are relevant. One is we believe in representative government. We believe in working with our representatives and holding them accountable. 2, we believe in the initiative and referendum process, but initiatives must be clearly written, legal, and limited to a single subject. And 3, we believe there must be adequate revenue to support desired civic services and facilities. So these are key principles. Taking those principles and then looking at Measure C, we analyze it against those, looking at documents and information provided by the supporters and information provided by the city staff report that was presented to council on June 12th. So we took those 2, and that allowed us to create what we call a fact sheet, which you may have copies of. They were available. Here it is. You probably can't read that, but I'll run through it fairly quickly just to show you the 7 issues that we wanted to compare. Not the things that we all agree on, but the things where there was a difference of opinion. Measure C will not affect existing leases, such as fire stations, library, LASD. The city staff report says that when leases expire, if the terms are renegotiated as opposed to automatic renewal, voter approval will be required. Moreover, the initiative's language is unclear as to exactly what conditions must be satisfied for existing leases to be exempt or included. So that's one point where there's a difference. 2, the language of Measure C is simple, according to the proponents. We find that the Measure C covers multiple subjects. The language is ambiguous. City staff and the attorney for the proponents disagreed in council chambers as to what it means, and we fear that the ambiguity will lead to litigation. 3, the language of Measure C is straightforward and narrowly drafted. That's in the documents provided by the proponents. We find that the language is unclear, again, back to what the city council discussion was about. They disagreed about the meaning of several provisions, and in particular, the parking plazas 1 and 2 and portions of 3 and 6 that are covered by the zoning designation of commercial use. That became unclear. 4, Measure C will not create obstacles for city improvements. Again, city staff said, any voter approval will be required for any easement or license to be given to public works contractors for projects that require access longer than 180 days. So we find that to be an obstacle. Proponents do not mention the cost of elections or who will pay the cost. City staff estimates that the cost of a general election would be $50,000 and a special election up to, it says $500,000 here, but it'll be high. Additional protection is needed to protect our city parks, is in the language of the proponents. City staff doesn't think that's the case. The city has never sold city-owned parkland, and in fact, we have a good history of buying parkland. Most of the parks were purchased. In fact, if you go through the list, it's pretty impressive. And subsequent to writing this up, the City Council has taken steps to amend the general plan to further protect parkland. And finally, the proponents imply that the sale of 400 Main would have been covered by Measure C. It's actually zoned downtown commercial and would not have Measure C would not have affected that as written. So with those facts or those comparisons in mind, we came to a position. The things that are important to us are representative government, working with our elected officials, and in particular, this idea that the people in the city would want to vote or even think about voting on leases doesn't seem likely, and paying for the privilege of doing that seems even less likely. Two, the language has, the ambiguity is a problem for us. It's gone from parks to protecting plazas and on to community character and the vision. I think one of the key things that we see here is this clear split amongst the council candidates, with Measure C and the vision on one side and the opposite on the other side. And then in terms of revenue, our fear is that there will be a declining level of economic activity if the vision isn't adopted in some fashion, and this Measure C will have a chilling effect on development downtown. And then if revenue declines, sales tax and other impact fees and development fees, for example, this restricts the ability of the city to function, and it affects the school districts as well. So for those reasons, we took a position of opposing Measure C. Now I have to say, in talking to people, there's a lot more than just the language of Measure C that's going on here. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this too, but what I'm hearing is that we just love Los Altos the way it is what people are telling me. It's the heart and soul of the city that we're trying to save. And this is seen, it's kind of a Trump-like message, the good Trump, okay, where he really wants people want to be listened to. They want to be heard. And they're saying that the city is changing and we don't like it and nobody's listening. So I see that as really what's behind Measure C. I don't think Measure C is going to solve that problem at all. In fact, I think it's a mistake. Still do. And I stand by my analysis on that, or we do. But I do get it that there's something else going on here that's bigger than Measure C. It's the whole, where's our city headed? And so, for that reason, Measure C might very well pass, but it'll be for the wrong reason, and it'll be a bad outcome. And I'll be interested to hear what Anita has to say about that, because I think that your candidacy would work well on just the measure of saving the heart and soul of the city, and divorce yourself from Measure C, but that's just me speaking. Anyway, that just is setting the stage. I do want to hear from the audience, if anybody wants to have comments or questions, Well, Kim. So identify yourself and
I'll let you go.
Hi,
No, you can help.
Kim Cranston. This is all very abstract for a lot of people, and I want to try to make it very real. Many of you know I'm a recovering attorney. I haven't intentionally practiced law in over 30 years, but when I did, in law school, I externed for California Supreme Court Justice Stanley Mosk. After law school, I clerked for a federal trial court judge for a year. I practiced at a major law firm and have a lot of experience around litigation and interpretation of things like this. A concrete example of how this would work is right here. They're talking about building a new library soon. When they get to the point where they're ready to do that, under Measure C, if this passes, first, the city would have to take to a vote of the public approval of the new lease for the library. It would be a new lease, not an existing lease, a new lease. That would cost $50,000 to $500,000. It's 50 if it's in a general election, even-numbered year like this November. If it's any other time, it could cost up to $500,000. For example, putting Measure C on the ballot this November is going to cost the city over $49,000. Putting Measure A on the ballot in 2015 cost the city over $372,000. Okay, so that's real. Second, once they got the lease approved and began construction, under this measure, they would have to go again to a measure on the ballot to get citizen approval for the easement or license for whoever's building the new library to do that. So there's another $50,000 to $500,000. So total cost to do a new library, which I think everybody agrees would be a good idea, could run from $100,000 to $1 million extra that I personally feel would be much better spent making safe routes to schools, paving our roads, providing more services to seniors and youth. So that's a concrete example of how this would translate. Think the same thing again if we build a new live theater downtown. Approval of the lease, approval of the license and easement for the construction. Any other project in town that is on the properties designated under Measure C would go through the same thing. I just wanted to make that point so people really clearly understand with a real live example right here what would happen under Measure C. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Kim. So I'm on the board of the History Museum, and I had that same concern. If we make a change to the History Museum in any way, it would have to go to the voters, and who knows how that could turn out. I just didn't feel like we wanted to be in a position where we had to take that risk. Sean, and then Margot.
I think Kim's argument is good, but it's not enough because, frankly, if it's a $10 million project for a theater or a $40 million project for a library, what is $50,000 is inconsequential. You know, it's worth it for direct democracy and let the people speak. The problem is we would never get there. So in other words, the problem is if we want to build a theater downtown, we need to have a fundraiser. We need to hire an architect and do some project. We need to do some engineering. We need to plan the whole development and do public-private partnership. And who will work with us for a year and a half to develop this project if they know that in the end, after a year and a half and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, we have to go and have an election? Nobody will. So essentially, and nothing is going to happen, not because of the cost, but because essentially the election at the end makes the whole thing a question mark, and nobody will work with us.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I agree. The chilling effect that this measure has on any future development is real, and it's probably intentional, quite frankly. I think the proponents of Measure C want to chill the downtown vision.
Hi, I'm Margot Horn. I'm interested in understanding the point of view of the proponents better. Yesterday, so I'm against Measure C, in case people don't know this. I was down at the outside of the farmers market speaking to people yesterday, and I had, to me, it was a pleasure, the experience of speaking to a gentleman who is a major proponent, and he said to me, no, it will not, having a new lease on this library will not trigger a new election. And so there I was, right? So that's one thing. And I said, yes, I said, yes, it will. Okay, there we were. And then the other point is I want to understand, as far as I understand it, this is driven by fear, and I would say fear of any kind of change. But I really, I said this, I said, what is the worry here, right? Especially now that we're going to have the general plan amendment, hopefully, approved by council on Monday night. So if you want to weigh in on that, what's driving?
Thank you, Margot. So, well, I think you're right. It's more than just parks, though, is the issue. We can protect the parks, but it's deeper than that. But you do bring up a point. You say it will require a vote on the lease, and he says it won't. It sounds like litigation is coming, and this is never a good thing.
I have to. This is my league hat that I'm wearing now. One of the things that we discussed at length in terms of deciding how this measure did or did not align with the adopted league positions is the question of clarity. And I think the concern that the league came down to is the very fact that we are having these discussions about what is or is not included, I think points to the fact that the language is not clearly elegant and is causing a significant amount of confusion amongst people who try to stay informed, but for other voters might be a very daunting challenge. So I just needed to. I'm going back to my corner, but I remembered we had that conversation.
New face, David Rock.
Just in response to the question that Margot raised, I was at every minute of every city council meeting regarding the proponent's initiative, and there's no question that Chris Diaz made it very clear that yes, it would affect new leases. Yes, it would affect any amendments to existing leases, and it's disheartening to me in a town that I love dearly and everyone in this room loves dearly that the proponents keep saying that Mr. Diaz did not say that. He did say that. It did happen. Watch the tape. And it's just a shame that we can't deal with reality. There are no alternate facts in the United States of America, contrary to what the Trump administration puts out. And there shouldn't be any alternate facts in the city of Los Altos. And I also wanted to add on to what Kim said. What people don't realize is that the issue of leases is based on the parcel size. It's not based on the size of the lease. So for instance, when the Hillview Community Center would like to do a lease for a coffee shop, a simple 800 to 1,200 square foot coffee shop, because the parcel is way more, it's in the hundreds of thousands of square feet, that particular parcel, and is way more than 7,500 square feet. The measure, as drafted, will take a general election for a 900, 800, 1,200 square foot coffee shop, which is the size of a small to moderate Starbucks or a small to moderate independent coffee shop. That's how poorly it's drafted. And to say it's not drafted that way is disingenuous and dishonest.
Thank you, David. So I did not know about the coffee shop angle. That's disturbing. Anybody else? Gary.
Gary Anderson, just a simple question of information. In one of the arguments during the past week, a statement was made that the city of Santa Clara has such a similar limitation on its government that it is required to go to public vote for any leases in the city of Santa Clara. Is that true? Does anybody know?
We actually have looked into that. Thank you, Gary. Who wants to speak to that?
I've looked at that. The city of Santa Clara, the Yes on C website says that there are two similar ballot measures that are measures adopted by neighboring cities, Milpitas and Santa Clara. Those were both measures with which the city attorney was involved in drawing. The city council put it on the ballot. Milpitas, they both concern park and recreational land only. Milpitas doesn't say anything about leases. Santa Clara does require voter approval for leases involving park and recreational land. That's the paraphrased language, nothing else. And that's primarily because of Levi Stadium. So a better example is, I think it was Measure M in Sunnyvale. That is was put together, according to the San Jose Mercury News, by disgruntled citizens. It covered leases on everything, and the voters voted it down. It had a lot of ambiguities. Getting to the ambiguity question, again, drawing on my experience with litigation in a trial court and personal experience working in a law firm, just because the two sides can't, there's a disagreement over what the city staff report says. Yes, on C, people are saying that's wrong. This just proves that this is headed to litigation. Yeah. It's chock full of ambiguities. That it should be renamed the Los Altos Lawyer Employment Act. And the city, frankly, will have the choice of a new lease to the library. Do we put it on the ballot? Or do we risk not doing that, and some neighbor who doesn't like the color of the tiles on the roof sues us? We're into litigation, and you may end up doing both. You may not put it on the ballot, get sued, spend a lot of money on lawsuits, and then end up putting it on the ballot.
Thank you, Kim. It sounds like you're still an attorney.
I'm recovering. It's a long process.
So, Gary, I think the answer is Santa Clara does have such a measure, but is limited to leases on parkland. So it's not the same as the Measure C that we are talking about. So in some ways, I guess this would be breaking new ground if this does pass.
Yeah. So the statement that was made by the proponents was in fact inaccurate.
Right. Yeah.
Hi. I think most of you know me as the former co-chair of this Los Altos Community Coalition. I served for 2 years with former Mayor Roy Lave, and then I served with David Rock for about a year. But I think beyond that, most of you know me as a mom in town and as a member of the board, the shortest member of the National Junior Basketball chapter locally. What many people do not know, and what I don't usually say to many people, is that I went to Harvard Law School, and I spent my last year at Stanford. And like Kim, I'm a recovering lawyer, but I'm a special type of lawyer. I'm a tax attorney. And tax lawyers are a very different breed of people. We are, all about statutory interpretation and looking at regulations and diving into what is the intent of the rule, the provision. And so for me, and I'll disclose that I'm inclined to be no on Measure C, but I have not actually read the language yet. That's a little thing I have to do this weekend. But I just want to say that in doing a lot of campaigning in town recently and hearing from people like Anita at Lava's forum earlier this week and at the debate, that it is clear to me that there are a ton of well-meaning, super intelligent, very highly educated people in this town who have vastly differing opinions on Measure C and what it means. And so for me, kind of like where Kim's going, is there might be litigation, and we might have to put this matter up, to the voters in a special election, which could be costly. But what my question is for Jeannie and John, and this just shows my lack of knowledge of city affairs, is what is our city attorney's billable hour rate? Every time, and if he can't handle this, because maybe it's a little bit too close, maybe we're going to have to go to outside counsel. I stopped practicing law in a big firm, and my billable rate was very close to $1,000 an hour. So these things, they're not just, like people say costly, but I'm really curious when you ask the lawyer, let's say the lease for the library is coming up, what do you think that's going to cost?
Thank you, Tamara.
Thanks.
Well, that sounds like a question for John.
Yeah, and Jeannie too. Two things. First of all, on the issue of litigation, the proponents of the Measure C say, well, it's not our intent. If you want to redo and, extend a lease or renew it with similar terms, that's fine. That's fine with us. The only problem is that's not what the language say, and there's no mechanism other than the court of law to settle that. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I want to say is there was another city that has a similar measure, and that is Los Altos Hills. And Los Altos Hills, I was on council when we adopted it. The citizens were truly worried about some people in council wanting to sell West Wind Barn and developing it to housing, to generate money, to monetize our land. Really, that was the objective, in order to take the money and underground utilities, which would cost like $50 million. So a group of citizens, including my wife was one of the leaders, led a petition, collected the signature, and the council, and I was on the council at the time, unanimously adopted it because it was a good measure. It made sense, and it says simply you can't rededicate, you can't repurpose open space and parks to anything other than open space and park. And number two, you can't sell any of it. It was very simple. It was 2 lines. We adopted it. We didn't have to go for an election. We saved the city money, and it had the force of an election.
Okay, thank you, John. You didn't get to the billable hours, but at least the idea that a measure should be clear and simple and direct.
So let me see if I can address the billable hours and putting it in the context of the situation that we as a city and many of the cities have. First of all, we do not have our own staff in terms of city. It's an outsourced function. We hire a firm. We've got a contract with a firm. So if you look at it, and our city attorney's name is Chris Diaz. You can't look to the contract. You can try to look at what his hourly charges are, because when it gets down to his hourly charges, first of all, a lot of his stuff is baked into the contract. Then there's the stuff that's above and beyond the contract that become billable hours, okay? Those billable hours will vary depending on the nature of what that is. If it is routine kind of things, as we're looking at, modifying our zoning codes, et cetera, it is at a more reasonable rate. As you start moving into the area of litigation, typically your per hour cost does go up tremendously. And I think, as Tamron, I think you did a really good job trying to put a framework around this. And you talked about the, you kind of look at, so from a legal point of view, and let me get my background here on this one. I am not an attorney, recovering or otherwise. However, one of the great pleasures that I do have on being on city council is I'm on a lot of mega boards, okay? And that includes MTC, it includes VTA, it includes Caltrain. And I can tell you a lot of our closed sessions deal with things similar to this. But when you look at the law and you try and look at the interpretation, what happens is today, while we're all considering this, it's fresh in our mind. We look at, okay, you can read a document that talks about intent. You can read in that same document the actual red line of the general plan amendments, okay? At the end of the day, what you're really voting on is a red line, okay? And you can look at what they call out explicitly as exceptions, and you can compare that to what is in the intent. Now, why I mention those two things is because down the road, when you have that first thing where a body now has to determine whether or not the law is going to apply to this, the first place that you look at is what the law is. And in this regard, it's what is the general plan, which is what the actual verbiage that we as voters are being asked to vote on. And you look at that. You then decide whether or not you think it falls or doesn't fall, and then the body needs to make a decision, okay? That body's going to make a decision, in this case it's City Council, and we're going to have to sit here and say, okay, wait a minute, is it black and white? If it's black and white, you move forward. If it's not black and white, then you're going to have to sit here and say, okay, what are your risks of litigation? Many decisions that council make, our informed decisions, are a matter of what is the risks associated with that, right? So we'd have to make that call. Once we make that call, all it takes is any one member of the public to say no, and then the threat of the lawsuit. Once the threat of a lawsuit, just the meager threat of a lawsuit, it then engages us spending legal dollars to try and understand what do we think are the risks associated with that threat. So now, if the language of the general plan is ambiguous, then most law, and particularly I'm used to dealing with state law, you end up then trying to say, okay, well, what did the legislators have in mind when they set this? And you start looking at that intent. That, again, is not superficial. It's done with the, I'm going to call it the ka-ching of the attorney to try and understand what the intent is. Those types of litigation, in my personal experience, and on two of the agencies I'm on, we're going through that, and I can tell you it's a ka-ching right now as we're trying to figure out how to keep moving forward, knowing that we're digging now into the intent of the legislation, and that's what makes it painful. And I think that's why you're hearing some people question, the ambiguity of this. If some of these things in the intent were codified in the language, it makes it a little bit more black and white. But I think that's where the gray zone becomes. But it takes us to a specialized attorney to go in and start looking at this.
Thank you.
What is a rough order of magnitude of a specialized attorney cost?
You know what, that I could not tell you off of the top of my head.
You should figure that
But you are talking
Way more than that.
Well, you're definitely, the bare minimum is 500, but yeah, you're probably up toward the grand. But again, I don't want to add to the hyperbole.
I'm hearing ka-ching.
I don't want to add to
I think we can
hyperbole,
leave
so
it.
I'm not going to speculate here.
I heard 600 to 1,500, and
I hear 1,000.
So I'll be told off, Bob. Anita, thank you so much for showing up. Has anything that you've heard so far caused you to want to respond? Are we on track with this? Are we off track with this?
Thank you so much for asking, Gary. I had the pleasure of speaking last week with the attorney who...
Speak up, please.
Is this on or not on?
It doesn't seem to be on.
This is a recording. You're just recording, so just talk loud so that people can hear you.
Oh, sorry. All right, sorry. I had the pleasure last week of speaking with the attorney who drafted this measure. And I am not an attorney, and I'm frankly going to say to Mr. Cranston that I'm sorry if you're continuing to try and recover, but the point is that the legal issues here are in land use. And people who are experts in land use are the people who should be addressing these questions. And I think it's unfortunate that we don't have, in fact, attorneys who have land use expertise speaking to this other than the attorney who drafted this, who sent 2 letters to the City Council regarding the measure. I'd like to just speak about a couple of things that I've heard, and I hope if I miss a couple questions or comments that people have made, please point them out to me. I've tried to keep track, but I might miss a couple things. First of all, and these are just random in here, Sunnyvale did have a similar measure with respect to leases. It was badly drafted. Everyone knows it was badly drafted. It was narrowly defeated. Second, with respect to one of the points up there that the advocates imply that the sale of 400 Main. The only reason I believe that they raised the issue of 400 Main was to demonstrate that the city has in fact sold land, not that there was land that would have been covered by this measure. So I think that's a bit misleading in its own right. To Jeannie's comment, which I think is a very important one, with respect to legislative intent, and I do have with me, by the way, the actual packet that was used to circulate and collect signatures, which has the entire text of the measure. And I would like to read, in case you haven't heard it, several of the things that this says. The purpose of this is section 1, the purpose of the Los Altos Protect Our Parks and Public Lands initiative is to provide Los Altos residents a voice in protecting public parks, public open spaces, and other significant city-owned properties. Effect, This initiative amends the City of Los Altos general plan to protect land owned by the City of Los Altos with a general plan land use designation of 1, parks, 2, other open space, or 3, public and institutional. It accomplishes this effect by requiring voter approval for actions that would alter the public character of these lands, including their conveyance and redesignation. The initiative does not apply to private property and includes exemptions to allow reasonable management of city land for the public good. Then there are findings, and I want to read item 5, and then I'll chat a little. This initiative applies only to actions that would significantly impact the public character of lands owned by the City of Los Altos. This initiative is narrowly tailored to require voter approval for actions that would significantly impact public use and access to city-owned lands. The initiative applies only to properties that are currently owned or which may in the future be owned by the City of Los Altos, not to private property. The general plan encourages these public spaces to be used for civic functions, such as cultural activities, special events, and programs. The initiative furthers this goal by requiring voter approval for actions that would effectively privatize these shared spaces, such as their sale or other method of transfer, their long-term lease, or their redesignation to other land use categories. The reason I read those is because it is well settled in California land use law that in drafting and a measure like this, an initiative measure, that the first section on findings, effect, and so on is in fact controlling with respect to the measure, and that one is not required or expected to repeat the limiting language in that first section in actually writing the, in this case, the general plan amendment red line, as Jeannie referred to it. Anybody who's an attorney, recovering or otherwise, I'm happy to provide you the court case sites regarding that. That said, there are a number of questions that you've raised with respect to the leases. So let's take the city library. Is there any question in your mind that this is a public building for public use? Does everybody agree this is a public building for public use?
But we're talking about the new library, which is not defined.
But does everyone agree that that our library is a public building for public use? If we were to take a new and build a new city library on city-owned land that is public and institutional land, which is what this is, it would not require a vote to establish or create or lease that building because it remains a land of public character. It in no way would interfere with the public character, nor would it, quote, privatize the space.
I just want to ask a clarifying question.
Sure.
Okay. And again, I'm not eligible to practice law because I would pay the higher fee for that. But this is a question I have for people who understand what's going to go into the community center. Are there times when private parties rent and use the various
meeting rooms in there? So for example, does the library, and I don't know about the library, but I definitely know that Hillview is, you can rent it for a for-profit business, for like a kids camp or a birthday party, and if I rent it, I can block access, and therefore it is being used for private use, and therefore there's an issue for an attorney or some litigant in the city. Yes, you're not an attornay, so you should.
No, but I specifically asked this question of the attorney. Specifically.
Which attorney?
I specifically, well, I said that up front. I asked about the person who drafted this because they are a very, very reputable firm. They have done a lot of, in fact, this is the only work that they do.
Who did it, please?
Shoot Mahali and Weinberger.
How do you spell that?
S-H-U-T-E.
Okay.
And then Mahali is M-I-H-A-L-Y. And Weinberger. And they said very clearly that this is not about use and what you're talking about, rental use. They're talking about the fundamental public character of the land. So for example, and we asked this question specifically, if this library were vacated the library. There was a new library built, and we moved everything. And this building was now vacant. And the city wanted to lease this building to a private entity for its exclusive use. That would be the privatization of public land, and that would require a lease. But to build a new public facility would not. The fire stations, the libraries do not fall into even the consideration of whether an extension or renewal of the lease has a significant modification. That question never even comes up, because you're not talking about the privatization or changing the public character of the land.
Okay, so you brought up some very important points, and I'm seeing a lot of hands that probably want to respond to that. And it's more than just the library lease. I think it would be good to get to the bottom of that particular question.
And I want to cover the construction lease as well, because that was dealt with in a response to the city attorney, that again, any easement that you might be construing as a lease, a temporary easement to allow someone to occupy some of the city space during construction and so on, again, does not fundamentally change the public character of the land, and that would not require a vote.
So we'll go back to our recovering alcoholic attorney, Kim, and get his response.
Yeah, it hasn't driven me that far yet. But, I fully understand that is the position of the attorney who drafted Measure C. In law school, I did study public land use, and when I was externing with Justice Mosk and Judge Terry Hatter, we had numerous land use cases. But putting that aside, I assume the city attorney and the city staff that prepared the city staff report know a lot about land use law. And I know that the attorney for Yes has sent letters to the city disputing things in the city staff report. I checked recently with the city, see if they still stand by their report. They do. And so it's very clear that there are at least two sides and maybe more with differing opinions about what the words significantly changed and things like that mean in the petition in Measure C. And so to get back to the cost of litigation, I don't know what the threshold is now, but generally it's hardly worth bringing a lawsuit can easily run over $50,000 and take a long time to go through the court process. People may be aware of the Martins Beach lawsuit right now being at Colsa State Lands Commission disputing land use law. That's been going on for years. It's headed to the Supreme Court perhaps. That's costing the state and hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of dollars. So these things, frankly, my guess is that the city would probably just put things on the ballot rather than risking the costs and delays caused by lawsuits.
Interesting, okay. So, is this directed to the leasing
Bob Simon.
point of view, Bob?
I want to come back to something that you said, Gary, early in the going here, where you said there was more to it than what is written down about Measure C and so on, and some of the concerns of the people who want Los Altos not to change, that kind of thought. I've been trying to come up with a concept I could use in a letter to the editor that would be different from what Kathy and others have already written. And I have an idea, and I want to ask you, and I want to ask everyone in this room, if this idea has merit, if this is a hook I can use in a letter to the editor. I have gone to both websites for and against Measure C. The website that is against Measure C has a very robust listing of organizations and individuals who are not in favor of Measure C. You look at that list of individuals in particular, they are wonderful people who have served this town in every conceivable way for decades as elected officials, as volunteers. They've gotten awards as volunteers. This is a remarkable list of people who do not want Los Altos to change in the wrong way. You go to the advocates for Measure C, and is it me or my new glasses? I cannot find a list on that website of people who are in favor of Measure C that's anything like the one that's on the adverse side. Am I wrong? Isn't that something I could say in a letter to the editor, that the people who want this town to be robust and thrive and change in the right way are the people who have served this town for a long time? Am I wrong about that hook?
So I'll tell you one thing, you're probably not completely wrong, but I have talked to a lot of people as I'm walking around too, people who are not on either list, and they're very concerned. There's some real concern on it. The people who are walking as proponents of Measure C, they're real people with real concerns.
Well, but they don't stand up and get themselves counted, and I think that might be, I just wanted the reaction of the group.
Well, I'll just say I stood up to be counted. I was very clear that I am a proponent for Measure C, and in consequence of that, I have not been reappointed to the Planning Commission. Clear retribution for my position, and so I think that it's not a surprise that some people would not want to stand up and be counted as proponents for Measure C. But beyond that, beyond my own personal circumstance, for which I take full responsibility, I did what I did knowing that there was likely to be retribution. The people that I have talked with that are involved in this included, because I think the question comes up about leases and about public and institutional land. Why is the public and institutional land there? And the issue that came up here was single subject, and it's one of the league's stated concerns about this. Initiative measures in California, by law, can only be single subject. If this was more than a single subject measure, it would not have been found to be legal and proper to go on the ballot. So that's a specious argument. It is a single subject. The reason that public and institutional was included, as I am told by the people who were involved in this, was because we have land, specifically here at Hillview, that is, in their view, important open space land, but because it is not considered park or open space, and that includes the orchards, the Hillview playing fields specifically, they felt that they needed to include the public and institutional land in order to protect and include in the measure space that is part of what makes this an open kind of city. And that's why they included the public and institutional in the measure. So I think that might clarify.
Well, thank you. So I agree, it is a single subject, but it's the ambiguity that kind of goes in different directions. Is it parks? Is it parking lots? Is it leases? That's where I find some troubling issues. So getting back to what's important to the league, one is working with our representative government and our officials. And so I don't like to hear words like retribution, or as a letter to the editor last week mentioned, shenanigans. Or not a letter to the editor, but a response to Measure C. So anyway, this kind of demonizing of our elected officials is very unfortunate. And I see that as part of what's going on here. It's very polarizing to our town, and that is a concern. We are close to wrapping up, so it's got to be quick. Vicki. That's true. I've got nothing else to do.
I have the little thingy.
The thingy.
I'm one of the nonprofits that exists on this piece of the Civic Center as representing the Los Altos Stage Company, who is just a very fragile, exciting and great nonprofit, but we don't have the deep pockets of a library or anyway. I'm not going to talk about any of that. We oppose, I oppose Measure C. I want to just comment on the first thing you said that the League stands for, and that's representative government. We have elected officials. If you don't like them, vote for someone else. That's the process of democracy in America. I can't see any reason why we would want our citizens tasked with trying to read leases and figure all this stuff out that we in this room can't agree on.
Thank you. David.
When Anita explained what she read, I appreciate, I think for everyone in the room, reading the exact language of the Measure C. I can tell you there is public land that will significantly impact the current use as proposed by the city, and it's the parking plazas. The other genesis of the dirty little secret is that the other genesis of Measure C came out of one of the 40 or 45 outreach programs done by RRM for the city for the downtown visioning. There were 20 tables. 19 of the 20 tables wanted vibrancy between 3 and 4. Either 3 or 4 or somewhere in between. One of the 20 tables wanted 1, which is basically no change to any of the public lands, including the parking plazas. As everyone knows who's been involved with the downtown vision, the scenario that was part of the plan that the city adopted includes the use of the parking plazas as well as many other, I don't want to use the word measures, to change the vibrancy and hopefully improve the vibrancy of downtown Los Altos in a national disaster of brick and mortar retail failing everywhere across America. I'm a commercial real estate broker. I do not do development. I've never developed 1 square feet of real estate. I do leasing for 32 years. The idea that was in the downtown visioning was to put something on the plazas. The majority of the people who went out and got the signatures for this were sitting at that 20th table. That's what this was about. This was about the contention over the Children's Corner, that lease being renewed at the Hillview City Center, and it was about, they knew the downtown visioning was going to be adopted, they knew it was going to happen, and it was Jim Jolly et al.'s desire to block everything having to do with the downtown visioning. There's no question that the parking plazas that are covered by the measure, it would be a change to the use. There could not be a single thing done on the parking plazas without a public vote. I understand that there's people in this town, and they're lovely people. They're wonderful people. There's nothing, I admire their passion for what they believe in, but that doesn't make it right that there's a downtown vision that's been adopted by the city. This is a direct effort to roadblock it. There's no question about it.
Thank you, David. I think
Tell us how you feel, David.
And I agree.
All right,
We're
not talking about a parking plaza.
So we are at time, but there's a robust dialogue going on here. So if people can choose to stay, I think that would be okay. Is the room okay? So we're clear if you want to stick around.
Laura? It's not a mic, it's just a recorder.
This will be just really short. I'm sitting on the fence, frankly, mostly because I'm confused. I have very strong feelings about how I want to see Los Altos evolve. I was born and raised here. I've seen it all. And I think, Bob, your comment about whether or not you had the right perception about why there were all these names on the against Measure C as opposed to for, I don't think because you don't run for an office, because you've never been elected to anything, that you can generalize and say we don't care about Los Altos, period.
Thank you, Laura. It's good to hear from somebody who is still on the fence. I'm glad there are a few people left that haven't become polarized.
I'd like to say, Bob, just be careful in what you say, because a lot of people who are supporting Measure C are very, very good people, and they just don't understand that this is a very complex issue. Now, some of the instigators, who started it, that's different, but a lot of people just signed up, signed the petition, and they think it's a good thing, and frankly, a lot of them came to me and say, hey, I proudly signed it. I say, you did what? And then when you explain to them what it is, they regret having signed it. But they're very good people, and so just be careful. They're very good people on both sides, to quote our president.
Tamara had a question or comment, and then Gary
But I
was
will-
re-
I will
I
respond
usurped
to-
because you were reading.
Mine's
Well,
really
no,
quick.
I finished reading.
Okay.
I just had to ask for the steering committee of the coalition that you please hold, and I don't know if it's going to work on your every other Friday schedule, but please have a town hall on the subject, and please invite land use attorney, and please invite the attorney for Measure C, because we're all, I mean, it's not my specialty, land use, even though statutory interpretation is, and in measures like this don't have the same kind of intent like a legislative record, because it's a bunch of, you know, things that people wrote down. So I really feel that we need to do that, and we need to invite parents of kids, you
Yeah,
know,
no,
school-age kids, and really get it out there, because
That's a good idea,
a lot
I
of
think.
people in this room already have decided. You know, there's just a few of you who are on the other side.
Well, you
So,
said that you're a little bit thinking about it still,
well, I
too,
want to read
so-
the language before I formally
Sure, yeah.
endorse one
But
way or the other.
It's more than just the language of the measure.
Yeah.
It's deeper than that. But I would like to say, in response to this, I was hoping today to address all of these questions that you had came here prepared with your opinion, and by explaining the process and how we really tried to be neutral, even though it's difficult because we all have opinions. And the league ultimately did come out in opposition to Measure C. So
Right. So what I've distributed was something Nancy asked me to bring because I was coming. The last thing I want to say is that I've researched similar measures to this all over this valley, and we have a lot of them. The oldest one I could find was in Palo Alto in 1969. And in every case, even where, as someone mentioned in Santa Clara, the city council was actually supporting it, ultimately the city attorney wrote something saying it would be a problem and recommended that they oppose it. The history of these, in every instance, Saratoga, Milpitas, Sunnyvale, Santa Clara, Palo Alto, every one of them has been opposed by a large number of the organizations, such as the gentleman referred to, that are found on the No on Measure C website. Every single one.
that doesn't
And
mean
yet-
they're wrong.
No, I'm just saying, it is always the case
Yeah.
that these are opposed. And yet, for those that are passed, and the overwhelming majority of them passed, there has not been litigation, there has not been problem, and one of the reasons that there is language, and I'm not going to read through it, and Tamara, I'd love to chat with you about it once you've read the measure. There's language in here that specifically says that the city, if this passes, the city is responsible for writing all of the implementing ordinances and zoning codes and so on to make this workable for the city. So I think if this passes, much of this concern and some of what frankly seems a little hysterical to me all goes away, and this becomes a very workable thing for our town.
Two more comments, and then I'm going to call time.
David has his hand up high.
Just to be clear, again, we should use facts and not alternate facts. The great majority of these measures have not passed. That's disingenuous at the least and misinformed at the best. They have not passed. Number two, I wasn't talking about a parking garage, which isn't needed by our town in many people's opinion, on one of the plazas. I was talking about possibly a theater, a live theater.
You said every. I responded to your having used the word every.
I said
every. No, it doesn't matter. Either every or all.
Doesn't matter, but the reality is the uses that are part of the downtown visioning in the scenario 3 and 4, except for parking, which is obviously in the public use to have parking, every single one of them would be blocked by this measure. Every one of them would be a change to the use of a parking plaza. There was a Godby survey. The Godby survey is not just a phone survey of people who happen to have landlines. It's a real survey. It was done. 83% of the population of this town wanted either more increased vibrancy or significantly more vibrancy. Those people also came to many of the workshops, and that was part of the outreach program done by RRM. So to me, it's disingenuous to have the proponents keep coming around, keep proclaiming that the leases would not be, and the fact that it includes leases would not be to the detriment, the possible detriment of the survival of our downtown. It's just
I don't think anyone has said
All right,
that, David.
thank you. We have one more we had one more time for one more question.
Comment.
Comment.
Possibly.
Comment. Jeannie, I think, was next.
Thank you. You know, no matter which side you come on, let me just put something into maybe perspective that kind of helps. All of us who have ever served on city council have all sat in the exact same seats that you guys, every one of us here, okay? At some point, something motivates you to step forward and to run, okay? And you run with every good intention. But I don't think there is a single council member in the history of Los Altos, and Vicki, I'm looking at you, your husband served, you know, where you go in and you don't learn a heck of a lot, and you find yourself drinking out of that fire hose. And part of drinking out of that fire hose is because things that might seem so simple to the naked eye, okay, are very, very complex. You're balancing so many issues and such. The sheer number of hours that are spent to look at and study these things it's really hard to imagine unless you sit there and try it, okay? And so for me, when you look at this, and at the end of the day, if this thing passes, it's putting every one of us as a resident, okay? I will term off of council, okay? I will just be back to Jane average citizen. But you have to ask yourself, what does this mean for the city of Los Altos going forward in something that is a pretty widespread here? And that is, you know, is this going to be done by social media? Is this the thing where, you know, even when we look at both sides have said the exact same thing. You know, it's so easy for finger pointing. All this hyperbole, okay? And I'm not going to dispute, there's a lot of hyperbole out there on both parts of this. But you know what, it's that the hyperbole that actually plays in social media, and that's where you're going to end up with this in terms of, what am I really doing? How do I, and I ask each of you, ask yourself, when somebody stops you on a corner and asks you to sign a petition, how many of you automatically sign the petition? How many of you look at who's knocking on your door asking you to sign that petition? How many of you read every word in that petition? You know, we don't do this. I've made many mistakes. Okay, I've endorsed candidates prematurely and regretted that, and have made a pact with myself, you know, in terms of what I do and how I look at things. We are shifting a major burden directly into the direct hands of our voters, okay? Now, the other thing I want to mention is we can talk about a lot of these cities, and I would actually ask Anita, in terms of maybe reaching back out to the authoring attorney, and to have him cite every one of their clients or any city that has the exact same type of thing in place. A lot of these measures, if you look at Milpitas, if you look at some of these other things, when you talk about a representative form of democracy, even the people who wanted to do the initiatives, okay, they were willing to engage with their representative form of democracy, their elected officials, and say, this is what's causing me pain and anxiety. What can we do? Okay, you know, and it breaks my heart as one of these electeds to say that I really wish the proponents of this had come to us and asked to have a discussion about this. Because then maybe we could have been like Milpitas, where with that open discussion, okay, Milpitas as a city put a ballot initiative on there. It did pass, okay? That ballot initiative did not come as a result of the council by itself. It came out of the dialogue, the kind of meaningful dialogue you would expect to have as you make tremendous decisions that affect the future of our city, okay?
Well, I think on that note.
So think about that.
So thank you, Gary.
Thank you so much.
So I think that the last point to be made, and this is a very good and robust conversation, is that regardless of the outcome of this election, we are all neighbors and we are all citizens of Los Altos. And this is proving to be a very divisive issue. We need to find a way to bring the community back together, regardless of what the outcome of this is going to be. Regarding upcoming coalition topics, there has been some discussion of having the candidates here. There's been another proposal about a town hall or something to that effect on this particular topic. I think the steering committee is going to have to get together and have a conversation about where all of this goes next. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.